Um, so the way it's going to work is me, Gill, and Olivia are going to have a conversation, and we've got the chat. And the great advantage of that is that you could be talking among yourselves or throwing ideas out there in that space while we're having that conversation. So you can almost have a parallel conversation, and I believe Olivia is going to be keeping an eye on that as well. But the great feature of doing it this way is that you can also submit questions. So you'll see that there's a Q&A option that should be available for you to submit questions. So Jill's going to ask some questions and Olivia's going to ask me some questions first, and we're going to have a bit of a chat for 10 minutes, and then we're going to see if we've got any questions from you that you've submitted, or we'll just carry on having a conversation. So if you want to ask something of us, that's how you do it. And if you want to just talk among yourselves, you've got the chat option. And I can see some people have introduced themselves in the chat already, but please do continue to do so if you wish. This is the first time we're trialing this. It's a new partnership between Friends Quarterly and Woodbrook. So also, this is a bit of an experiment, and we appreciate your understanding that this is our first time, and hopefully it goes well for everyone. And I think that covers it for the technicalities. If you're having any issues, please do put them in the chat. But I'm going to hand over to Gill and try not to worry about the technical side and just answer questions then.
I'm not worrying about the technical side at all. You know far more than I do, so that's lovely. I'm Gill. I am one of the co-editors of Friends Quarterly, and I hand over to...
I'm Olivia. I'm the other co-editor of Friends Quarterly. And Gill and I took over about a year ago in January last year, I believe, as editors. And since then we've done various editions, but this is the first time we've had a conversation around one of the articles and with one of our writers. And we hope this to be the first of many. As Jon said, it's the first collaboration we've done with Woodbrook, so hopefully that'll be a very fruitful partnership going forward. But as he said, this is an experiment, so we shall see how it goes.
So, Jon, firstly, thank you very much for writing a stimulating article, even though there were several paragraphs in it which I completely did not understand, and I'm still trying to get my head round Twitch, but we can come back to that. Let's start, first of all, with something that I do understand, which is Quaker structures. And you suggest it may be our structure and our sense of who we are and who we can be that is holding us back. And I wondered if you'd like to say a bit more about that.
Starting quite strong there. Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about the way we're structured. And I remember sitting in yearly meeting when the question was to revise Quaker faith and practice in this country, in Britain. And one of the things was pointed out is that so much of what we had been inherited and had been around for a long time, and I think that shows. And because it's layered over even older, existing structures. So you can see, for example, we have a lot of area meetings in rural Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Cumbria, because that was the historic heartlands. And then we have meetings in London that are split up around train lines and things like that. That you can see that historic structure, which I think the point I was trying to make in the article doesn't map on very well with modern life, and particularly with people who are moving around or engaging more fluidly. And I know that's something I tested in my own area meeting by applying for membership, having been based in a different part of the country, but worshipping online in a different area meeting. So that's kind of the most top level thing, and we can go further and further and more radical out, and maybe we will throughout the evening. But I think that was part of the point I was making.
Yeah, and when I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I think the abolition of general meetings, for example, might have been a lost opportunity given all the charity regulations that came in, and perhaps it would have been useful to establish, mega regional area meetings that covered what's currently 1, 2 or 3 or 4 area meetings. So yeah, we're definitely in a state at the moment where we've got too many jobs for too few people, and there's not enough capacity sometimes for activism and prayer, which I would say is why many of us choose to be and remain Quakers, not to sit on committees. I think that's one of my my bête noirs, really. So Yeah, and I mean, the other thing, if we're starting at the beginning, I mean, in your opening paragraph, you talk about Quakers being insulated from many of the criticisms thrown at other churches, and our way of worship, spiritual openness, and legacy of activism is an appealing mix. And I do agree with you about that. Yet when I look at us in the context of Black Lives Matters and read that we're one of the whitest churches in the UK, I wonder what sort of community we are and we want to be, you know, and are we sort of practicing cloning and like us behaviours rather than being open and it's beyond welcoming, isn't it? Accepting that what Quakers offers may be of use to a whole range and variety of people.
I think that cuts to the heart of the tension that I see in 21st century Quakerism, which is, you know, we can talk about how regional meetings might make more sense, but actually, in terms of people coming across Quaker ideas, Quaker theology, Quaker ways of worship, Quaker ways of being, Quaker writings, you know, that's a global thing. The barriers to that are not defined by regional meetings as much as they're not defined by area meetings, as much as they're not defined by yearly meetings. And we've seen that with online worship. In my experiences from Woodbrook, we've seen a whole range of inquirers inquiring about, I remember particularly one individual who was on his own in Singapore and just interested in Quakers and wanted to be a Quaker, but he was coming to a Woodbrook worship, he was reading Faith and Practice Online. Our structure doesn't know how to handle that. It doesn't know what to do. And it also raises the question that for me, which is where I think, I don't know if this feels quite radical, but it asks us a question of what is our purpose? And is our purpose to service a yearly meeting, an institution? Is it about the committees and people meeting on a Sunday and the meeting houses, which is geographically bounded and is rooted in these ancient, almost ancient institutions that have a lot of value in them? But if we look to that, what we see is something that's not particularly dynamic, something that's bounded by things like geography. And that to me feels really different and isn't very diverse, and feels quite different to if you look at the people who are engaging with the ideas of what Quakers offer. And I think for me, I'd love it if someone was to disagree with me or ask a question about this, but for me, Quakers is about an idea. It's about the inner light. It's about the Christ within. It's about the spirit. It's about being spirit-led, transforming experiences. And we have such a wealth of writings, and that manifests in so many different ways that I think that question of, well, of course, when we look at local and area meetings, it's not particularly diverse, but the ideas of Quakerism and the theology and the concepts of Quakerism are quite exciting. And you see that with people who engage with Quakers online, and notice in the context of younger people, it's actually the structure that we're offering that isn't working for people. And I think that can partly be resolved by our welcome within meetings. But I was trying with the piece to push the boat out really far and say, what about Quakerism that doesn't have local meetings or area meetings or membership? What people meeting and doing Quaker things and being Quaker community that just is so far away? And we fall into the trap of I mean, I would argue there are as many Quakers out there doing Quaker stuff that don't fit in that structure at all than there are in the structure. So we're asking the wrong questions and we're looking in the wrong places.
Yeah. And my perception, and Olivia, you can probably back this up, is that there are a lot of people who identify as Quakers under 30 who have got Quaker networks, Quaker activities, Quaker service, but aren't necessarily seen in Sunday meeting for worship at all.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I certainly have a lot of peers who have said something very similar, because you can be quite mobile, whether that's kind of moving away from home to a university or moving for a job, or just various reasons really, or just suddenly not having somewhere to live. Renting, you can be a lot more mobile than if you kind of own a home, for example. So you can definitely get a very kind of large demographic of younger Quakers in particular, but any age Quaker really, who is not necessarily fixed to a certain location, but still feels very strongly connected to the Quaker community wherever they are placed. But that can be harder to kind of affirm, especially if there's no process for membership which kind of reflects that. And that's actually something which in the Q&A, I can see we've had a few questions which are kind of picking up on this whole theme of membership, which actually ties very neatly into a question I was trying to kind of ask. One of our kind of commenters mentioned that they had a very difficult process in terms of their membership, and kind of very strongly feels that change would be very worthwhile. And you mentioned, John, in your article that we can be limited by our own processes within Quakerism, and the example you gave actually at that point was about membership and how we count membership. And as you noted, we have members and we have attenders, but we don't really have anything in between, before, after. It's just those two things. You're kind of either in membership or not in membership. And I guess, people have been asking in the Q&A as well, I have this question too, how do we kind of tackle that limitation that we maybe are currently facing? Do we kind of say, we have a spectrum of membership? How would we define those kind of things? How would we organise that? Would we risk falling into a hierarchy of membership if it's based on how long you've been attending? How would you kind of decide what membership you go for? Would it be purely self-selective? You say, I'd like this kind of membership, almost like a subscription, where you say, I'd like to pay the £1 subscription, or the £5 subscription, or the £10 subscription. And maybe we don't want to go quite that far in terms of an actual monetary value on it, but just thinking about that idea, or even to go very radical perhaps, do we just abolish membership entirely? Is that actually a more equal way of going about it? Is that a fairer way or a simpler way? But if we do get rid of membership, if we did consider that, would that affect our sense of community as well? Is it actually quite important to have that idea of membership in order to affirm your own space and your own sense of belonging? That's a lot of questions there all at once, John. I do apologise, but I think it is picking up on what various people are saying in the chat as well.
I think we could read some of these out, because I think that would be useful for everyone to be thinking about. So David's saying, I wonder why it's taken so long to come up with a solution to friends not strongly attached to a specific place. And even now, Quaker Life Centre Committee is only beginning to feel ready to look at it. And I'm sure the experience of the last year has made us realise that, we can be active as Quakers, unattached to a geographic place. The number of people I've met in worship, particularly Woodbrook online worship, we're from all over the place, all over the world. Tim is talking about his own membership process, and then saying what we can start tonight is to rethink membership. So it's based on trusting the callings of newcomers. Perhaps it could be as simple as a single clearness meeting, rather than distrusting newcomers through our antiquated and off-putting process. And I often wonder what the visit process is about, because is it a pass or a fail? Are we saying you've got to answer questions in a specific way for us to say yes, or are we really saying we want to tell you a bit about ourselves and welcome you into this Quaker community? So I think that conversation about the nature of membership and thresholds is useful. And then David is saying, a friend described today's online meeting for worship as a container for our separateness, which struck a chord. So he's saying that we can't rethink community without also unpicking our assumptions about place, and particularly our traditional place-based physical presence as a specific form of worship. And of course, we've all been experiencing worship in the ether, haven't we?
I think if we want to talk about membership, we have to look at how we've ended up with the membership structure that we have. I've gone all over the place in my position on membership. I've recently been accepted into membership, having called for its abolition as well. And I think it's so important to understand where it comes from. So we talk about membership as convincement, but that doesn't look very much like the writing of convincement that I see from people like Margaret Fell. When we talk about convincement as a spiritual experience, And then we've kind of co-opted that, and then we talk about convincement in the context of a bureaucratic process. And that the membership structures that we have, that formal membership structure, from my understanding of looking at the history of it, it's a pragmatic, practical thing. It's about who's in what area, when people move around, how do we make sure that they're welcomed in the new place. And it also comes out of a time of oppression. You know, we need to know if someone's in jail, who's looking after the family. So we've got that system. And then we found that that's quite almost like a relic from even before the Manchester Conference kind of time. It's like, and we've sort of pushed that and said, oh, okay, yeah, you're allowed to marry outside of Quakers. You're allowed to, we've opened that process up and all this sort of stuff. But we're still kind of trimmed around the edges of that membership process. And then we've got attenders coming in, where we've got this whole group of people who are attending regularly, and we're saying to them, oh, well, we see you every week. We're going to count you in our numbers because our membership numbers are really low. And in reality, we then get to this situation where attenders are doing more and more roles that members are doing. And so we start to say, well, attenders, members, they're the same thing. And then the people who don't want to apply for membership, we say, oh, you can just be an attender. And well, maybe we'll get you on the committee even if you're a attender. But then you look at where attender comes from and then the name of attender, and what the requirement bar for attender is regular attendance at a physical meeting for worship on a Sunday. So that now is also obsolete, and it in of itself was patching a hole in a problem that we never addressed previously. The yearly meeting in this country anyway has basically run away from the question of membership because it's too complicated on multiple occasions. But regardless of what the yearly meeting does, in some ways, and this is kind of the point that I'm trying to make in the article, we can talk about this all we want. It's happening. So people are going out there, finding out about Quakers, watching Quakers speak, reading Faith and Practice online, going to Woodbrook online worship, Pendle Hill online worship, and they're going, you know what, I'm a Quaker. And how do we stop them doing that? Because we either say, no, you're not, and then what do we gain from that? I don't think they're going to go, all right, I'll apply then. Or we say, well, this is obviously quite complicated, and this raises some really important questions for us about what it means to be a Quaker. And is it okay for someone to do that? And I would argue it's yeah, because it's similar to hearing George Fox preach in the town square and deciding you've discovered the truth and then going out and preaching that truth. That looks more like a model that's viable within that early framework than this idea of you must come at a certain time on a certain day. But that's yeah, and what frustrates me is that for Brittany in a meeting, and me and Gill used to work in the outreach team at Brittany in a meeting, we'd get in so many inquiries being like, I want to be a Quaker, and our response had to be, well, find your local meeting, attend, and after you've attended for 6 months, then you can be an attender, and then maybe after 2 years they'll accept you into membership. And I just don't think that's good enough. I just don't think that's good enough. And I think when people are having all different patterns of belonging, and maybe they're going to maybe they're having a one-off experience at a Quaker camp, or maybe they went to a Quaker school, or they were raised in a Quaker family, and then they're going off and they're living as and self-identifying as Quaker, and it's informing their values in the world that they're living in. That to me is okay, and that's exciting. I want to have that conversation. I don't want to have a conversation about whether we stick people on a list nationally or regionally, because that's not radical enough. That's another patch. It's not a solution.
Okay, so we have got one friend here saying, I don't want to see membership abolished. It gives a sense of identity and is valuable. And I absolutely agree with that. It's how do we expand that rather than narrow it down, I guess, isn't it? It's not about the list, but how do we embrace people who are finding Quakerism self-defining and may not yet have ever been to a physical meeting for worship. Another friend is asking, if there are no local meetings and area meetings, how will concerns and corporate witness be tested? And what if some self-styled Quakers decided to do something awful? My guess is that can happen anyway at the moment. People can do things as Quakers and not have tested it with their local meeting. And then we have to untangle it a little bit afterwards, would be my sense of what actually happens now anyway.
I want to come up to that point about the importance of membership, and yeah, my what I pitched there was kind of a position that I held for a while, and would say, let's just spin off the whole thing. Let's get rid of membership and start again. And I've been challenged then by people for whom there's a couple of stories that really stick with me. Someone for which making that commitment and joining that community and being held account by that community was really important for them, and they really wanted to make that commitment, and they got a lot out of it. So that was one story that really stuck with me and challenged my notions around that. And another one was a friend who was in a meeting, and they were being told, because the language that they were using was perhaps not particularly academic, and they had quite a colloquial accent, and they were being almost kind of bullied by sort of, you know, you don't have a right to be here, this is a serious conversation. And actually they were able to sort of say, no, I'm a member, and I've got every right to be here the same as you. So that interesting idea of is membership about subjugating people and controlling people, or actually is membership, can it be liberating, can it be helpful? So that sort of revised my position on let's just burn the whole thing to the ground, because I think those two are the two really important stories. But yeah, and we've moved as a yearly meeting to say it must be in this way. You must be visited by 2 people in your house, and to saying, well, area meetings can kind of do it whatever way they want. But I still think it's not quite right. In terms of, there's a comment that maybe I'll come back to later from Peter about committees and communities and worshipping experiences, so I'll come back to that later. But this idea of how does discernment work, and how does this structure work? How do we? And there's a couple of different answers to that, I think. And the first one is this is happening whether we like it or not. And a bunch of people meeting online and calling themselves Quakers and coming up with a statement and saying it's Quakers is always a risk. And I can tell you now, there's plenty of Quaker groups out there that deeply concern me with what they're putting out now. And I think that is not, what? Where have you got that from? So I think it's happening whether we like it or not. And it's quite an old fashioned way to think, like, we can control it in this way. But the other side of that is, a lot of the certainly explicitly Quaker communities that I've come across are doing that stuff in different ways. So they are still practicing Quaker process and doing discernment, and that stuff is coming alongside it. And it's actually more of a question, I think, for those established institutions to answer the question. I don't want to. I think we're asking the wrong question if we're saying, how do these groups have a concern or test a concern? And my question is more, well, how does a body like Meeting for Sufferings, that's supposed to represent all the Quakers in this country, do its job if it's not able to get the concerns of a huge group of people that are? So how does a group of young friends meeting online, or it needn't be young friends, it's just my experience, who are meeting in what we would recognise as Quaker worship, and are providing mutual support to each other in what we'd recognise pastoral care, and are having threshing meetings and are coming to positions on things, and then that has nowhere to go, is more of a problem for Meeting for Sufferings than it is a problem for that group. It's time for us to catch up rather than to say, no, stop it, what are you doing? Because they're following the leadings, they're following where the Spirit's telling them to go, I think, but I would say that.
And I was touched by what Tim was saying earlier about maybe membership is clearness meeting. So actually the individual is going through a process of spiritual discernment to say, this is where I feel led and called to practice my faith. You know, we all have an individual relationship with the divine. We all, or many of us, have a need for the collective experience, whether that's virtual or in person. A clearness meeting would be about an individual explaining why this is the right place for them at this time. And when I say place there, I'm not talking about a geographic place, but a place of belonging, if you like. Yeah. And I think that would then respond to Matt's question about what would the criteria for membership be. I think it would be about self-definition and a willingness to do that through a process of discernment. That's a possibility anyway, isn't it? I like the idea of people self-defining what their Quakerism looks like for them at that moment, because if we are evolving spiritually, it's merely a snapshot of the moment, isn't it?
Does that then kind of lead into those questions about what Quaker identity is, though, and kind of how are we kind of corporately defined almost? You know, if you have a definition of Quakers in a dictionary, do we say that is what a Quaker is, or is it purely if you believe certain things you are a Quaker, or if you believe a certain way and you feel that is the Quaker way, you are a Quaker? It's a bit tricky, I guess, isn't it?
It is tricky because as a group we've agreed that we work together to discern things. So it's not that we just get to completely decide what we want in of ourselves. We actually get together and try to listen to where we're being called in a given moment. And this does challenge that. And I think that's a question that we need to come up with an answer to. But I think for me, as I've been wrestling with this for the past 5-6 years, I'm more wedded to the idea that we actually can say something about what Quakers is and what ties together even Quakers around the world that have different ways of worshipping, different shapes to community, and all these different expressions of Quaker community. There is something that ties them together, and that particularly in this country, our fear and the way that fear around religious difference and the way that the media has characterized that and the baggage that we come with, and I include myself in that, means that we're often avoiding that question. But I think actually, like, if you look at it, we do have some relatively fundamental principles that explain why we structure ourselves in a certain way, why we make decisions in a certain way. Why we don't vote is because we listen for God, we listen for the Spirit within all of us, which is accessible to all of us, which is why we don't have priests. So, like, there is some basic stuff that holds us together, and around the world, some Quaker communities have gone, actually, we do want Quaker pastors and ministers to help us with that process, but there's still that underlying, like, there's some underlying stuff about that transformational experience, about that light within kind of stuff. And I think if we start from that point and say, let's build out from there, rather than saying, let's start with local and area meetings and people that like to meet on a Sunday morning together, and people who turn up to the meeting, and what do they want and what do they look like, and start from that point. That's where we're going to hit stalls, and we're going to hit problems with it, because there's so many voices not in the room, and our priority is pleasing people in the room, not following I'm going a bit off topic there, I don't know, but that's my instant reaction to a very difficult question.
There's a couple of questions here which are about sort of the institutional structure, and I will talk about them a bit, but I will also say that remember that everyone who sits on sufferings is a friend, everyone who sits on a Quaker committee is a friend, so all of our decision makers are friends on the benches. So let's not think there's an us and them. So Graham's asking, is BYM focusing on the wrong area by introducing local development workers? Should more focus be going on new developments? So that's one question. Another one, it's sort of on the institutional dynamic, is in this context is not a problem that trustees, all of whom are friends on the benches, and Friends House staff, many of whom are friends on the benches, lead the yearly meeting without wanting to hear the concerns of friends on the benches. And I would always first answer such comments with, friends on the benches are invited always to offer their service to be friends on the benches and friends on the committees. So it's not an us and them, and I think, you know, that's not a helpful place perhaps for us to get caught. But are we going to offer ourselves as trustees? Are we going to offer ourselves to sit on committees? And then how do we deal with that tension of looking at the strategic agenda and local, if I use business terms, you know, local operational behaviours? That's where we get the tension almost, isn't it?
I think in terms of local development workers, I mean, my experience of working with them is that they're very innovative people, and that we have to support the structures that we already have, and that this isn't a either or problem, and that actually what we offer in what we have to offer still from established local and area meetings is very appealing to some people, but also that this stuff is coming out of it's in part coming out of people that I've talked about who are quite invisible, but it's also coming out of people who sit within those structures, and actually whether BUAM chooses to deliver that nationally or regionally, I think is an interesting decision that they've obviously made with BUAM Ward Book trustees. I don't really want to get into, but I think it's a service of delivery, and it's more important that that the yearly meeting as a church and as a charity is aware of what might be falling through the cracks, the voices that aren't there. I think there's strength in having some of that centralized, in the sense of some of the stuff around digital comms maybe, but that again could easily be done regionally. So it's I think it's a little bit of a red herring, but I agree that there's a risk if that local development program is about, let's just keep all the local meetings afloat, but I don't think that is what it's about. And in terms of the trustee stuff, I agree with what you say, Gill, but also we need to be mindful of the barriers for people serving on those groups. Mm-hmm. And again, that is a structure that's built on decades-long assumptions about people's time and their commitments and their interests. It's a system that's certainly the Friends House infrastructure as it is now, the Brittany meeting, I should say, now that it's all online and around the country, is built by a certain group of people at a certain group of time, and it certainly makes a lot of assumptions about people's time and income and ability to commit. It's not particularly easy for people who are working unusual shifts or are single Quakers in families. A lot of committees, trustee bodies require membership. So I think one of the things that could be really exciting, and it's a question for the other meeting as well, is can we learn from other organisations about how they make themselves feel open to everyone? And if we live in this world, we have a system that's built on a bunch of people get together in a meeting house in Lancaster, and the people ride in from Garstang and Balerig and Preston, and then they decide this is going to be the person. We're going to sit in contemplation, and we're going to decide who we're going to send on a horse down to London every quarter. And then the person goes down on the horse to London and sits with the other people who travel down on the horse to London and discerns the direction of the meeting. And then they ride home, and then they do a presentation about what they've heard and whatever. That's kind of what we've got. What we could do is do a live feed where any Quaker can turn up and hear it. We could, yearly meeting online is going to be really interesting this year. And what we've seen with the yearly meetings going online is people from all around the world are then going to them, and that's then raises interesting questions. But again, I think we can be quite inventive about that. And it's not about saying these committees aren't worshipping communities, or they're not Quaker, or they need to be burnt down again. But it's about saying there's some really interesting questions here about what this structure looks like, And if we are moving to much more fluid patterns of identity and lots of different types of Quaker community, and some of those will be in person, but they just won't be local and area meetings, and some of them will be local and area meetings, we can't have a central structure that's assuming a system that died out 50 years ago.
Thank you. And I was reflecting on what you'd written in the conclusion about, you know, not seeing the wood for the trees. And then you were talking about saplings and dead wood. I mean, obviously, those are sort of judgments. But to look for saplings and to nurture them, we have to be conscious and willing to let new things grow. So, yeah, there's a lot of lovely other comments coming through. Claire, I hear you, friend. Still, after 4 years of attending, I'm finding the language a barrier, and I'm wondering why. How does the truth prosper and right ordering and meeting for sufferings are necessary, or what they're even about? And that is such a good reminder to us, isn't it, that we have this in language that you know, is part of our tribal experience. You know, we use words in particular ways, and many of us know what they mean, but not all of us. So that is a helpful reminder. Thank you. And then, David, you've asked a question about if we're moving into a world that's increasingly formless, and it's more malleable and global and interconnected, and still retaining our traditional in place, where we know our boundaries, how are we going to set new boundaries? And well, I guess, you know, the next question could be, do we need boundaries?
I think that's similar to the question of, you know, what makes a Quaker and what does that new membership kind of structure look like, isn't it? I mean, all of this is huge and difficult stuff. I mean, that's the cop-out answer is to say it's for us to decide, which is, I suppose, true. But then the problem I think that I'm trying to highlight is this question of power and who gets to decide. And if only a certain type of people are able to attend area meetings and only a certain type of people are able to attend yearly meeting, do we really lean on those Quaker processes and trust that the spirit will guide those people and that they have you know, they're representing more than what they are? Or do we need to really have that conversation, but have that conversation by listening to lots of different voices to inform our decision around what that boundary is? Because there's a very easy answer to that boundary, which I think is kind of what the yearly meeting decided last time it questioned membership, which was, oh, this is too complicated, let's just draw the line as where it currently is. That's a boundary. We could say, actually, we're quite happy with the current membership system, and we're quite happy that the boundary is attendance, because we think that people need to show up a certain amount of time, and that's where we're going to draw the line. As our yearly meeting, and everyone who falls out of that isn't part of our yearly meeting. And maybe they're part of something else, but they're not part of our yearly meeting. That's a valid answer. It's an answer I campaign against, but it's a valid answer. But I would suggest that what we would want to do would be to hold a whole variety of different, and maybe this is part of what the Book of Discipline is thinking about, I don't know, but hold a whole series of story gatherings and different ways to try and understand what's going on in different Quaker things, and then that might help inform where that line is being drawn and really ask some big questions, because this isn't explicitly a question around power and privilege and that kind of conversation, but it has so many overlaps. Like, so yearly meeting gathering, which I know some people absolutely love, and the physical meeting together for a long period of time in a physical space, it's really powerful, and I don't want to take away from that. But the reality of someone spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds and going away from their family for a week, I mean, even going away online for 3 weeks apart from, that's hard to do if you are in a lot of circumstances. So then the nature of that gathering is going to be reflected by the people who are able to go. And as much as you can do bursaries and all sorts, you're never going to get over that. And if your membership process, if you're an attender, you have to ask permission to attend yearly meeting, and we go, oh, don't worry, that's just a formality. But still, that means, if I want to be provocative, I always remind people of Switzerland, which, yeah, I'm a Swiss national as well as a British national, and Switzerland is a very, very democratic country. But it's also one of the last countries to give women the vote, because it kept asking men via referendum whether or not to give women the vote. And I worry a little bit that that's what we do at yearly meeting when membership comes up. We sit in a room of people for which membership by definition works, of which maybe we have some attenders, but they have to ask for permission, even if we know that that's just a formality. Maybe we have some young people because we're kind of loopholing them in, because if they go to YMG, we say they're in membership, so they get around it. That's not necessarily the best space and the best bunch of people to be having a conversation about whether membership works. There's all sorts of barriers there. And again, if we're saying, oh, we're so white and middle class and old, and it's like, well, yeah, because you're meeting on a Sunday morning in a white middle class area as a bunch of old people. Why is it a surprise? And I'm being provocative there, but like, I think we've got to be a bit provocative. And, you know, that's why this is important. It's important for Quaker renewal, but it's also important as part of that broader conversation about who we are and what we are and why we've got to where we are now, which is a declining church that isn't particularly diverse.
And one of the words you mentioned a while back, John, was about trust. And I think there is something about how do we trust the people who serve on our behalf. And perhaps we could have more conversations about the way in which service is given. You know, people are serving humbly on behalf of the wider Quaker community, and that's always, I think, a really salutary thing to remember, that we are there in the service of the community. And there was a comment earlier about, you know, should we be, or does the spirit expect us to have boundaries? And, you know, I always think it's wonderful when we start putting God in boxes and saying what we think, you know, God wants for us. You know, the infinite, the divine, the unknown, and we're trying to sort of explain it with edges. We're always going to fail, aren't we? And yet we're human, and we think things in boxes are much easier to understand and explain.
About barriers, though, John. I'm so sorry, Jill. It was just to pick up on because kind of quite a large portion of your article is talking about the football manager community and how well that works in terms of supporting various members in different ways. And I know you kind of talked about how sometimes actually that community can feel more supportive than the Quaker community. And I just wondered if you maybe had any thoughts or reflections about what exactly Football Manager or any other community might be part of does well, that Quakers can maybe learn from, or the kind of barriers that Quakers have in place, which you have touched on already in part, that we could maybe look at trying to dismantle.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that question is that I made a really clear distinction. I was talking about the Football Manager community on Twitch. I wasn't talking about every Twitch community or Twitch in general. I wasn't talking about Football Manager in general, because I don't want to paint it as a utopia, and I also don't want to paint it as very diverse, because it's not. I mean, it's interesting because it's a community that's quite weighted towards men, and Quakers are actually quite weighted towards women. So that in of itself is interesting. It's relatively age diverse. It's one of the few places other than Quakers where I interact with people of a wide age range, or the workplace. But what's interesting about this sense of community on Twitch is that all of the people who stream Football Manager on Twitch have a sense of being part of, as having their own community that they're cultivating, and they might be part of multiple communities, but they are part of a broader, bigger thing, and that there's then leaders within that community that have made it really clear that they won't tolerate sexism and racism and homophobia and that within that community. And so I think that's helped people, and that's where that role of moderation comes in, and that it's not necessarily the people streaming who are part of that, it's also the people who are moderating the chat, who have the power to delete comments, who are making those decisions around that's not an appropriate comment. But for me, I picked it because it's quite a different example from Quakers, but there's those interesting overlaps and parallels. Now, why is it that it's more supportive than at times has been more supportive than Quakers? I think is a very curious question. I think there's some of the stuff that I read about how, which I think I referenced in the article, about how sometimes anonymous relationships with people can be more supportive than when you're able to present yourself in a way that you're bringing a certain version of yourself into that space. You can then meet people where they are and have conversations without risk. You know, if I tell somebody that I've been talking to about Football Manager that I'm having a really bad day and I'm, you know, worried about having to go onto antidepressants, and they really judge me and stop talking to me, that's bad, but it's not as bad as if I get ostracized and kicked out of my family or what, you know. I mean, there's a different relationship there. So, but what's also is I guess built into that community is this idea of, you know, people are doing it, a few people do it for a living, but they're doing it for fun. And when people turn up, they're like, hey, how you doing? Welcome. And, you know, I've made a really good friend through it who was just like, you know, whenever you turned up, they were like, how you doing? And you start, oh, I'm doing all right, how are you? Have a bit of a chat. You know, you could talk on Twitter or whatever, talk on another platform then. And that explicit welcome being built into that community. You see this in a lot of online communities. It's come and be part of it. It's welcome and come in and you can identify with this, and here's our little in jokes. They're all there for you to see. And you know, we're all playing the same game, so we have this commonality that we can draw upon. And you come into perhaps a Quaker space, and sometimes people are putting big barriers up, or they're not welcoming people, or they're not explaining things, or but there's not to this, that's not there to the same extent. I don't know if that answers the question, but
that's helpful, John. And I was thinking about Twitch, which I've yet to visit or be on or follow or whatever the correct terminology is, but I mean, we know there are Quakers already with large followings online, and you mentioned Jessica in your article, and I know Peterson Toscano is another Quaker with a large online following. I wondered if any of the participants wanted to suggest people in the chat space we might like to see on Twitch or another platform. So yeah, if you've got any good suggestions there, do pop something in the chat space. And when I was reading about fandom in your article, John, I was thinking about Quaker special interest groups or Quaker listed groups where people feel a connection for a cause such as refugees or an experience such as Experiment with Light. And I recognise that I am a Quaker fan. You know, I have my fandoms with different groups that I'm a member of. And I do that alongside my local worshipping community. But I quite liked the idea of thinking it as a fandom. You know, it's got an energy and an enthusiasm to it. And I wonder if that helps us revitalise some of these relationships, that these groups matter to us because we have passions that coincide. So it's not just the group we might worship with on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday evening or whenever we meet for worship, but these particular special interest groups are where perhaps where we're being nudged spiritually, where we're being stretched to grow. So I thought that was rather a lovely concept about, you know, me being a Quaker fangirl.
I think what really excited me when I read up about some of the academic work around fandom is that what distinguishes it from liking something and why it's been so transformed by the internet is that it's about being participatory. So it's not just about I there's a difference between being a fan of something and being part of a fandom. Is usually the distinction is made by anthropologists, sociologists, as you contribute to it. So you make fan art, or you join a fan forum, or you go to a convention, which to me is a model that's quite exciting in a Quaker context. But then also, when you look at the way young adults, well, not even young adults, teenage Quakers, the way that they make memes about Quakerism, and they're making memes about whatever, Marvel, Harry Potter one day, and then they're making memes about local meeting the next day, and that's interesting. I think that's really interesting. And then when you have fan communities based around personalities who then happen to be Quaker, so you've got a distinct community that's based around certain values, but of which some of those values are either explicitly or not Quaker values. That again is really interesting. It's like, I don't have I've tried to formulate some of my thinking around that, but I don't have what this means. I just think we should be paying attention to it. And what's exciting about that, and what's exciting about the potential for Quaker identity, is people are in multiple fandoms at once, and people can have multiple religious belongings. We don't ask you to commit to being a Quaker and then you can't do anything else. You could be a Quaker and a Harry Potter fan and go to an Anglican church every month. So we are in a good place to capitalise on this, but we're maybe not. And why is that, I guess, is a question.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to go back to Daphne's question. How concerned should we be that a more free-flowing definition of being a Quaker might lead to more people having the benefits of worship and community, but not feeling obliged to contribute money and or service?
Again, that's why I used the Twitch example, because in the context of those communities, I mean, I moderate for a Twitch channel. It's a very, very small one. I don't do the streaming, but I help the person who does the streaming and run polls and moderate the chat for them in my own free time. So that's an example of giving service. And the way that people donate money through Patreon, crowdfunding, Twitch subscriptions, Twitch bits, the way that people make a living on the internet is by building communities that fund them, that say, this is worth, I want this to exist. I'm going to give money to it. So are Quakers doing that? Maybe we need to do that more, and maybe that's something we need to get better at communicating about. But I don't think it's, I think if ultimately, it's like with some of the online worshipping groups, if no one's willing to step up and run them, they die out. And that's okay. But if people are willing to step up and run them, they carry on. Or the people go off and do something else. And if we need to buy a Zoom license, we do a whip round and we buy a Zoom license. If we need to pay for a Discord server, somebody stumps up the money and pays for the Discord server. That's, I think, what it might do, though, is it might prevent us having huge, big Quaker institutions, because they rely on, it's almost democratizing it, though, if you're relying on individual donations.
I'm reminded of the Quaker phrase, way will open. So it's a bit like if the people want it, it will happen. Rachel says, I feel like underneath all of this is a feeling or a question of belonging, and how do we expand and include those who feel drawn to and want to practice Quakerism? I found the approach from YFGM, Young French General Meeting, really liberating. As soon as people attend, they automatically become members of Quakers as an attender of YFGM, and we are able to serve and contribute. What a wonderful example. Also, having creative approaches and cooking together is pretty inclusive. That eating together is often at the heart of community, isn't it? The phrase that keeps coming to mind is when 2 or 3 people come together to worship, nothing more is needed. In terms of belonging and practicing Quaker worship and connecting with spirit, the light, the divine. Thank you, Rachel. I think that sums up things beautifully. and that there are ways of being Quaker without boxes and rule books. Which then perhaps takes us just on to Matt's comment. Is there a difference between a group of Quakers doing something and a Quaker meeting doing something? We can act individually if we choose. What would that leave us within our Quaker communities? And then Matt goes on to ask about where does the Book of Discipline, Quaker Faith and Practice currently sit in all of this? Well, I think we've said it sits under review. And certainly the experience of the last year, I think, will encourage us to think more loosely and more widely about what a book of discipline might look like. Is it even going to be a book, or is it just going to be an online thing that evolves and doesn't get fixed for 30 years at a time? There could be some wonderful outcomes from all of this.
It's quite radical that we do put it all online for anyone to access. And I mean, that's something that, again, working for Britain Uni Meeting Outreach, we would come across people who were engaging with that. And sometimes people, I mean, the one that always sticks with me is someone who said they read it every day but didn't consider themselves a Quaker. That's really interesting. They didn't consider themselves anything, but they read it every day. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I think it is a big question. Is there a difference between, I think there's a huge difference between an individual saying, I'm going to do a thing and it's a Quaker thing. And I think if they're going to do a thing and it's a Quaker thing, but it's something that is well established as a Quaker thing, that's okay. But if it's something that's not well established as a Quaker thing, that puts us in interesting territory. And a group of Quakers getting together and deciding a thing. But I don't know whether, well, at the moment, there's a big difference between whether that's an official local and area meeting that's tied into the official structure and can send a minute to sufferings and can be recognised and formalised versus a bunch of Quakers getting together. But I think following the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, if a bunch of Quakers get together and do something and follow Quaker processes, if we believe that that's how the spirit works and manifests itself, then I don't think the spirit cares whether it's in a local meeting structure or in a different way. And I guess that's where the tradition of epistle writing is quite helpful in that.
Thank you, John, and thank you for an article which has stimulated a lot of conversation, a lot of questions, fewer answers perhaps, but a lot of comments as well. And I hope that's given people even more food for thought and perhaps ideas to take back to the structures that do exist: local meetings, business meetings, area meeting, conversations, yearly meeting. And I will finish by sharing a comment from Julie. She says, if people are worshipping and taking part in community, they are contributing. And I think that's a beautifully simple way of describing what it is to be a worshipping community. So thank you for that. So thank you, friends. John, you wanted to put a survey somewhere?
Just on a practical note, because this is an experiment and it is the first time, and because Woodbrook needs to fund itself in some way or another, if you have the time to fill in the survey and let us know how you think this went from a practical perspective or whether the topic was interesting, I would really appreciate that. It's really helpful feedback for us if we want to do this again. So
people need to cut and paste that and put it into their...
You can just click it and it will open up.
Just click it and do it now is what you're saying, Olivia. Okay, friends?
I just clicked it, I just opened it, all fine.
Okay. So
yeah, it takes a couple of minutes. So.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's felt an exciting new adventure for us at Friends Quarterly. Quick what, says Beck. The link in the comment above, Beth. And anyone else? Oh, John's put it in again. So maybe we'll see you next time. Friends Quarterly is by definition a quarterly publication, and so our conversations are likely to be quarterly as well. But thank you all. If we close with a moment of quiet.